Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Las Lajas Black Honey Processed Costa Rica from Swerl Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Swerl, based out of Falkenberg, Sweden. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Finca Miresh, a wash-processed Nicaraguan coffee. And when picking up that coffee, I saw this one and it immediately caught my interest for a couple of reasons. The first of which being that it is a black honey processed coffee and we're yet to review any non-washed offering from Swerl as of this moment. And the second reason being that this is a Las Lajas coffee, and longtime viewers of this channel might be familiar with my sentiment towards Las Lajas, as I would say that they're consistently one of my least favorite coffees in existence, and it's a coffee that we usually like to revisit from time to time in the same way that we like to revisit a coffee that I do enjoy, like the Boer Terroir. So if there is a coffee roaster out there that is capable of making us enjoy a Las Lajas coffee, then that certainly earns them a lot of points in our book. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Once again, even with the processing, you can certainly tell that this one is on the lighter side of things. And I continue to push the point that Swerl is exactly what you'd expect from a Nordic-based coffee roaster, as they do have that more light profile in general, but even then, not necessarily extraordinarily light like a lot of coffee roasters, even coffee roasters in Europe are doing, but still notably light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was very reminiscent of previous iterations of Las Lajas coffees, as it's very red berry forward with some slight citrus. There's a slight wininess in the acidity in the intermediary, but the coffee transitions nicely into a cleaner, more candied sense. So I would say, relatively speaking, it was a nice start. And let's just refresh a lot of people's memories, or anybody that doesn't necessarily know why I'm not the biggest fan of Las Lajas coffees. It's mostly because they are just so red berry forward and so winey forward. And what I remember from those coffees is that they really became popular around 2000, around the same time a lot of anaerobic naturals were being released. So I was trying out a lot of these Las Lajas coffees, and it got me, I want to say, pretty burnt out on this specific flavor profile. And since then, so many coffees have offered these same characteristics, red fruits and wininess to them. So experiencing that on that first try wasn't necessarily ideal, though helpful, or towards the end, it did help that it did have a fair bit more of a cleaner candied sweetness to it. So I'm like, okay, maybe there's potential for me to like a Las Lajas coffee. Day 18 through the Chemex, and the coffee was a bit more reminiscent of other iterations of Las Lajas coffees now, as it's even more red berry forward, to the point where it's a bit fermenting and overbearing with notably less of the sweetness and candied aspects. So I said, okay, maybe this coffee isn't just made for a Chemex, so we'll see if maybe we can fix this one. Day 21 went through the April brewer, and the coffee essentially feels like an in-between between those two brew methods, as the experience is offering more cleanliness and clarity than it was with the Chemex, but still less so than it was with the V60. Still in line with the strong red berry aspects and complementary citric tones to it as well. So once again, not really necessarily enjoying this coffee. We move on to day 24, as we opted for the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and the coffee is still overly reminiscent of other Las Lajas coffees, as it does have the strong red raspberry seed red fruit characteristic that completely dominates the cup. And that's always the way I've described these coffees, is that they have this very bright wininess to go alongside the very notable and prominent red raspberry seed jam aspect. Less cleanliness and intensity, as the coffee does continue to increase with more strong citric aspects, so it also had a very, we'll say, bitter, zesty citric quality to it as well, which certainly didn't help. Day 27 through the Chemex with Swerl's recipe, and it is continuing to skew even more in the Las Lajas red fruit side of things, as it has a slightly cherry cordial feel to it, as it has a cherry fermentiness to it as well, which is another characteristic that has been consistent with this coffee. Strong red raspberry seed with plenty of notable lime-like intensity as well, so all characteristics I don't necessarily enjoy. Day Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it has reverted the coffee back to its best as it's leaning heavily into the Las Lajas-like aspects with an overly fermenty red fruit and that strong winey acidity. Once again, plenty of citric brightness, very intense and direct, but this time it was just a little cleaner, so that's the biggest and best takeaway I had from it, though this coffee is just continuing to skew so much more in that intense sense. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it seems like this coffee has been, I would say, somewhat overtaken by those red tones, as it's essentially just overly red raspberry dominant, strong wine acidity. There's going to be very little deviation from those notes because that's what this coffee is. It's just so strong, heavy, and overbearing in those specific characteristics that it's just very hard to get anything else out of it. Day 37 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was one of the better days of this coffee up to this point, as there's at least a little bit of the candied sweetness, but that was fleeting, as I would say that those red characteristics just continued to dominate this one, especially with that wininess and more of that citric lime, red florals, all of it's presented in such a very strong and intense manner. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 5s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the finish, level 5. So the finish is presented in the other 2 things that you see within this tasting wheel. Scoring at the level 5, it has an extremely lingering brightness to it, that winey brightness that I just don't like. I mean, I don't like wine to begin with, so having that very intense acidity to it in a very long-lasting sense isn't anything that I enjoy whatsoever. And then the berry fruit is the other thing, as I say. Unless it's an extremely clean blueberry or extremely clean strawberry, it's very hard for me to get on board with a lot of coffee scoring there at that level 5 mark in terms of the berry aspect. And given that it's skewing probably my least favorite out of all of the berry aspects, that very strong red raspberry aspect, I mean, the lingering finish is something that was definitely something I don't necessarily enjoy. They're just a little bit too heavy for me in those specific aspects, and they were overbearing. I oftentimes say that I'm happy if it doesn't reach that level 5 because it doesn't reach the point of overbearing, but this coffee certainly did pass that threshold. A couple of level 4s. We'll start with the sweetness level 4. What's very interesting about the sweetness is, as I was drinking this coffee, I said it was maybe sweeter when it was a little cleaner, and you could feel a little bit more of those candied aspects, but it's not necessarily sweet, which doesn't help given that it makes this coffee a little bit uneven. If it would have scored at least a level 5 for sweetness, then maybe it could have balanced out the acidity, but for the most part, having the acidity dominate the sweetness of this one wasn't necessarily ideal for me. It was just, tricky in that sense. Citrus fruit, level 4. To top it all off, I don't really like the bitter citric qualities that can be presented in a coffee, and this one having a lime zest, a lime-like component to it, to contrast all the other qualities that I wasn't the biggest fan of to begin with, didn't really help this coffee's case, and it was very pronounced. So we're getting the classic things I'm expecting from Las Lajas, and the additional characteristic is very strong citric lime. And I'm like, okay, that's not really helping the cause on this one. So level 4 is where we decided to put it. Let's move on. Florality, level 4. I could even see a very strong red floral aspect, given that the entire theme of this coffee was extremely heavy in that red sense to it. So florals also scoring there high at that level 4. We move on to the level 3s. We will start with the stone fruit level 3. I can see a very slight plum characteristic to it. There's a little bit of a stone fruit quality that's presented. It's hidden, buried underneath some very intense and strong dominant aspects, but I felt that enough to notate that at that level 3 mark. Caramel level 3. It is candied, and this tasting wheel was made on one of the better days when it was a little bit more candied in that sense. So that's what that caramel is. It's exclusively the candied aspect of the red fruits, but for the most part, that was an ever-fleeting quality to the much more robust, dominant, I shouldn't say robust, but dominant, winey brightness. Savoriness, level 3. Yeah, I can see a little bit more of some savory red fruits also in this one. Okay, we'll move on. Body, level 3. It still had a fair bit of texture to it, so it is a little bit more medium bodied in general, and had kind of mixed reactions to that, given that this coffee, well, there were just a lot of tricky things within this coffee, we'll say. I just wanted to skip to the final thing. The cleanliness, level 3. I think that might be a little generous. It's not necessarily overly fermenty. It doesn't have anything, I suppose, that can really take away. The flavor profile is very direct. It's very defined. Like, I'm looking at this tasting wheel. I'm trying to go through all of these things, but it just reminds me of exactly what this coffee is and why I don't like it. But the cleanliness there at that level 3 mark, it's essentially because it doesn't belong in a level 2. It has a fair bit of fermentiness, which restricts it from scoring at that level 4 mark. That being said, the profile in this one is about as well defined as you could expect. I mean, it tastes exactly what you're going to expect this coffee to taste like, and they're very pronounced and very intense. And if anything, maybe with the acidity being so skewed out of whack could take away from the overall cleanliness, but it's just there mostly because it's not clean enough, obviously, to score to that level 4, and it's not harsh enough to score at level 2. So that's where we opted to put it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. First things first, this experience will not take away from my feelings on Swerl in any capacity. Anytime I review a Las Lajas coffee from any coffee roaster, I go into it knowing that it's not going to count against them, it can only count for them. So if a coffee roaster does have a Las Lajas that I very much enjoy, then I will give them massive points and massive credit. Unfortunately, that was not the case with this one, as this one reminded me so much of all of the other Las Lajas coffees that I have had in the past, which is that they do skew very much in a lot of directions that I don't necessarily enjoy, and that's why I affectionately dub it my arch nemesis as far as it goes to coffee. It's just not my thing, and that's basically the best way to say it. Is I'm sure there are a lot of people that like this specific profile. It's just everything I don't necessarily like. The overly dominant, heavy characteristics of them, the overly heavy, whiny brightness to it, the very strong red aspects to it, and even the citric quality that was also accompanying it. It's just not my thing. So it's personal preference. And other than that, I mean, I think Swerl did a very good job of articulating a lot of those qualities. Like, they're very defined, they're very pronounced. You can certainly feel them throughout the entirety of this one. So I suppose that transitions into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you like Las Lajas, go for it. I mean, this coffee is the epitome of what you expect Las Lajas to taste like. And thinking through all of the Las Lajas coffees I've had in my life, they all have this pretty similar theme to them. And I want to say something that differentiates this one from those others is that it has a unique lime-like characteristic to it. At times it can be a little bit more candied. So those are the unique qualities for this one. But that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this coffee, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Las Lajas Black Honey Processed Costa Rica from Swerl Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.